So where's home for you? Where would you say you belong? Where would you say you're from? I've lived in about 30 different houses in Wales, in Scotland, and across 8 different counties of England. So I found these questions a bit confusing. For the last 20 years, I've lived in Oxfordshire, raising a family, putting down new roots, but I don't have any old roots there. Where I do have old roots is East Kent. I went to secondary school here in Canterbury for 7 years and lived in the city for a while. My parents had roots in Ramsgate, Folkestone, Sandwich, Sittingbourne. And then about a year or so ago, I found myself having kind of nostalgic pangs for Canterbury. I've very rarely been here in the last 30 years. And I had this idea of doing a personal pilgrimage, as people do, from London. And then that was before I knew about this event, so it all sort of came together. So the first question was which route to take and which button to press. There we are. The obvious, lovely, bucolic route to take would be the Pilgrim's Way, long-distance footpath which snakes its way through lovely Kent countryside. But it's basically a Victorian invention with a nice piece of nominative determinism. It was conceived by a man called Albert Way in the 1850s. In Chaucer, in the Canterbury Tales, he mentions 7 different places between Southwark, where the pilgrims start, and Canterbury, and they are all plotted in the red dots on this map. I've also plotted with the blue arrows wells and springs and ancient waterways dedicated to St. Thomas, and the purple ones are chapels and churches dedicated to him. And it's very obvious that the route that most pilgrims would have taken from London, at least, was what we think of as the Roman road Watling Street, which is itself a misnomer, which we'll come to. In his book about Watling Street, John Higgs says, Watling Street is a road of dreams, imagination and stories, especially on this stretch from London to Canterbury. I can't tell all of the stories, and mine are completely different from the ones in his book, and I'm sure there's many more. But here's a selection from my walk from London to here, arriving only about half an hour ago. It starts, of course, in Borough High Street in Southwark. This street brings together lots of things. At the top of the map, you can see Thomas Street, which is at the back of London Bridge Station, which is where St. Thomas's Hospital used to be, and it was originally built and dedicated to Thomas Becket. Chaucer's fictional pilgrims started at the Tabard Inn, commemorated with a plaque still. The Marshalsea Prison was originally just down the street. That was ransacked by Wat Tyler in the Peasants' Revolt in 1381. It then moved down to the bottom of the street and was where Charles Dickens' father was imprisoned in 1824. And then at the confluence of the Roman streets of Stane Street and Watling Street is St. George the Martyr. This is where Henry V was welcomed in triumph on his way home from the Battle of Agincourt. All of these stories intertwine and continue to do so on the rest of my walk. The first place that Chaucer mentions is St. Thomas a Watering, or the Watering of St. Thomas. This is a place of echoes and ghosts. It was where the horses were watered because there was the Earl's Sluice River, now one of London's lost ones, but it still feeds Burgess Park's lake nearby. Henry V was welcomed here by the clergy of London. In Tudor times, there was a gallows here where religious dissenters were hanged. In the last 200 years, it's been a pub. In 1888, a mysterious bag was found during the Rippers' rampage. The bag was full of knives and scissors. In the 20th century, it's where Henry Cooper, the boxer, trained. David Bowie practiced for Ziggy Stardust there. Echoes and ghosts. And above it all, although it's no longer a pub, above it, the gaunt figure of Thomas Becket hovers still. My next nexus of significance is a roundabout in Greenwich Park. In a film made by John Rogers a few years ago, Ian Sinclair stands here and says, "The start of my whole writing about London project really was here. It's one of the most significant spots in the city. I realized there were these incredible alignments." Watling Street passes nearby. Just over the road is Blackheath, which is where Wat Tyler and Jack Cade assembled their rebel armies in 1381 and 1450. Probably people from the same families that came out to welcome Henry V in 1415 in the same place. onward. This time I took a detour off Shooter's Hill, which is the highwayman's haunt, and went down to New Elton on a personal visit. This house on the left I lived in when I was 7 years old. It was the house where my mother was born in 1930. My grandparents owned the house for about 60 years. My mum went to the primary school on the right, and I went there for a year 40 years later. Did it feel like home? Not really. I was lonely and unhappy there. Walking back up to Watling Street, I managed to track down my grandparents' grave. Last inscribed in 1984, it was already hard to find and hard to read. Back on Watling Street, here's Dartford. Dartford was an important place in the pilgrims' route. It had a foundry there which belted out badges for pilgrims to buy. And then when Henry VIII put an end to pilgrimage, the economy of the town collapsed. Watling Street is said to be visible as a hump in Bullis Lane here, and these buildings are also said to be haunted. And here's Holy Trinity, Dartford, just peeking out in the corner. Wat Tyler and his friends were marching to London and stopped here. He might have even been born in Dartford. They were on their way to murder an archbishop, Simon Sudbury. Henry V, of course, had been honouring an archbishop. And so into the Edgelands. My 15-year-old son, wearily walking with me, he joined me as far as Rochester on my quest. Here is just before we reach the modern pilgrimage site of the Blue Water Shopping Centre. And from Blue Water to Ancient Water, just a mile or two along, is Springhead. This is where there are 8 springs feeding the River Ebbsfleet, and archaeologists have found 12 Roman temples there. It's also where the country's first watercress commercial farm started in 1805, and it's still a nursery to this day, 200 years later. The poet Dan Simpson, who was in residence at Canterbury Roman Museum 10 years ago, did a route down Watling Street, and he described this stretch from Dartford to Rochester as unwalkable. Challenge accepted. My son and I took a detour to Cobham. This is the Leather Bottle Inn. A leather bottle, of course, was an essential piece of equipment for every medieval pilgrim. This pub was immortalised by Charles Dickens in the picnic papers. Only a few years later, a man called Richard Dadd, a young artist, was convalescing just down the same street. One evening in August 1843, he went for a walk with his father, Dad's dad, if you like, and brutally murdered him in Cobham Park, claiming afterwards that he was possessed by the Egyptian god Osiris. Dickens was rather taken with this story, and the two men's lives intertwined because they were only 5 years apart in age and both grew up in Rochester and Chatham. Dickens took his friends to the site which became known as Dad's Hole, which my son and I unwittingly walked right past on our journey. On the 7th of June, 1870, Charles Dickens was in Cobham Park again for the last walk of his life. A lifelong obsessive walker. 2 days later, he died. This, the other side of Rochester, is Newington. It has a mysterious pilgrim's tomb. This is said to be the shrine of St. Robert and may contain his relics. And he's believed to be a murdered pilgrim on the route. In 2019, a new housing estate called Watling Place was being built. And archaeologists found a Roman temple, which has been rebuilt as a reconstruction here. Only a couple of fields away is what the Victorians used to call crock fields because of the sheer number of Roman finds in the field. I found some potential Roman pottery there myself, which I meant to bring, forgot. The old name for that site is Keycol, and this is said to come from Caii Collis, which is Caius Julius Caesar's hill. The next village along is Key Street. The village has mostly been obliterated by a 1980s roundabout, but Key Street comes from the Saxon or Jutish Kaising or Casing Street, Caesar's Road. This is the real old name of Watling Street. Further along, Bapchild. In the top left-hand corner is the site of the ancient spring of St. Thomas. I trespassed across a couple of fields and managed to find a boggy area, which was a modern vestige. But there's also a new housing estate called Spring Acres. And there, of course, is the Bapchild wastewater pumping station. A little further down, I took another family detour. In my bedroom in Oxfordshire, we have an old chest of drawers which belonged to my great-grandmother, Eliza Allsworth. Her family came from Linstead. I walked down there, visited the church, found some family graves. Did this feel like a home? Not really. Didn't have any personal connection to it, so I didn't really feel anything. But then afterwards, I learnt that Eliza's own great-grandmother was called Hannah Greenstreet, and there's been a Greenstreet family living in this area since Chaucer's time. And Adam Greenstreet joined Jack Cade on his rebellion. And I love this idea that the Green Street is a name, the road. The road's name is shared with some of my ancestors. The name has also gone from the map because it's now absorbed into Tenham, and the only sign of it now is Green Street Methodist Church. Here at the top left is Stone Chapel, which brings the Roman and the medieval together. It's said to be the only place in Britain where a Roman temple was then built upon to create a Christian church. But it's lain in ruin for 500 years and is now marooned in a field next to the busy A2. And then on the bottom right, the Maison Dieu at Ospringe. This was a place offering hospitality for centuries of pilgrims, including royalty. Henry V would have passed through here on his return from Agincourt. 7 years later, his coffin rested at Ospringe because he was dead and it was going on the same journey all the way back to London. And so to today's walk. I passed through Dunkirk this morning. The village sign commemorates two things. They are very proud of the radio transmitter and also the Battle of Bossenden Wood from 1838. This is yet another rebellion along this ancient path, a rather short-lived one. A man who claimed to be Sir William Courtenay, but in fact was a Cornishman called John Thom, who had previously been in Kent's County Lunatic Asylum, gathered a small band of men together in armed protest against the new poor laws. But it didn't last very long. And then here is Harbledown, where at last there is a well to St. Thomas that still survives, which I visited again this morning. And this is the ancient 11th century church of Harbledown, St. Nicholas. This church is said to have a shoe buckle that belonged to Thomas Becket in it. It was locked, so I haven't been able to prove this. But the 16th century Dutch theologian Erasmus visited here with his friend John Colet, and they weren't very impressed when they were invited to kiss the buckle for a donation, of course. Colet expostulated, "Do these fools expect us to kiss the shoe of every good man who lived? Why not bring us their spittle or their dung to be kissed?" And so to Canterbury, two hostels for pilgrims. At the top, of course, is the Eastbridge Hospital, famous since the 12th century and still helping the community today. At the bottom is a bed and breakfast in London Road, which in fact was known as the Pilgrims Road because Archbishop Simon Sudbury from 1379 built the West Gate and diverted the pilgrims. It was also the house I lived in when I was 15, and I'm staying there tonight. Will it feel like home? I can't tell you yet. Where we're from is complicated. When I had a DNA test, it confirmed my Kentish stock, but also showed that 15% of my genetic inheritance seems to be from Sweden and Denmark, which brings me to the Jutes. We don't know much about them other than they settled in both Kent and around the Isle of Wight. Over there in Jutland, there seems to be little evidence of them. In Kent, the Ing place names like Sittingbourne, Newington, Ospringe, along our Kysing Street may be Jutish. Is my Kentish DNA pointing back further in time to Scandinavia? Is that where I'm from? But we're all fossil records of ancient migrations. All along this route, I have found vestiges of the ancient ways, echoes and ghosts. Signs persist, but they mark absences. Perhaps that's what our identity and sense of belonging is too, a form of cognitive dissonance, holding multiple versions simultaneously, echoes of our past selves and our ancestors. The self is like the ever-changing road, and the journey is our real home. Thank you.
Hi everyone. So I'm Emmy Alderson. Today I'm going to present the Pilgrimage Project reenactment within Pilgrimage's performance. I'm a theatre maker and I'm a researcher at the University of Salford. So the Pilgrimage Project is a practices research PhD which explores the intersection between pilgrimage and contemporary performance. So the main purpose of this research is to examine pilgrimage as a creative act of performance. So Will Parsons from the British Pilgrimage Trust identifies that pilgrimage is a creative work, like a work of art with you as both the artist and the canvas, so establishing a link between pilgrimage and visual arts practices. So he highlights that pilgrimage can be a creative act. So this statement really became a vital starting point for this research, to identify where creativity lies in the process of making pilgrimage, and really for me to forge connections between performance and pilgrimage. So in this presentation, I will be addressing one of my key research questions: what creative strategies can be applied to pilgrimage as performance? So remembrance is really one of the main motivations currently directing my pilgrimage practice, where I've been examining how to remember, but also reinterpret Virginia Woolf's historical walks. So I've really been responding to her creative engagement with walking as a walker writer, and how it was central to her writing process. So in this way, I really consider that my practice contributes to the ongoing canon of walking women's art practice. And I would also like to preface that by saying that for me, that is trans-inclusive, and that women's walking art practice was really brilliantly established by performance academics Dee Hedden and Cathy Turner as a way of addressing women's historical exclusion from walking arts aesthetics and how contemporary women artists engage in walking arts practice. So I'm very indebted to their work. So this PhD research is underpinned by practices research as its main methodology. Robin Nelson defines practices research as an approach where practice is key method of inquiry, and where in respect to the arts, a practice, so theatre and performance in my case, is submitted as substantial evidence of a research inquiry. So in this research, pilgrimage is a key method of discovery. So I'm engaging with the practice in multiple ways to explore the creative possibilities as a form of performance. So I've used performance, walking scores, interviews, and theatre archaeological documentation approaches as methods to activate the aims of my inquiry, to identify pilgrimage's creative potential as performance. So within this project, I am creatively reframing pilgrimage practice away from its traditional religious associations. And instead, I'm examining it as performance. So one of my first methods is performance scores, and throughout this performance lecture, I will be sharing some brief extracts of that. So walking artist Claire Hines states that a score for a performance is a creative composition marked for a page, constructed and designed for actors, performers, or audiences to follow as a guide to interpret, experience, or perform. So I've been using the performance score to explore how to compose a guide of my creative pilgrimages. And Tim Etchells taxonomizes the different forms of score for performance events that exist already, but are then selected by artists and turned into scores. So this form of performance score, identified by Tim Etchells, is where I would position my own performance scores, connected to Woolf's life. So I'm dealing with the events of her walking arts history. So Fiona Wilkie identifies that the retracing of somebody else's footsteps emerges as a rich framework for the walking artist. It imagines a historical relationship, establishing a dialogue between past and present walk. So consequently, the performance score as a research method has been a really fruitful space in which to compose an imaginary dialogue almost between Woolf and my reenactment of her significant walks. So therefore, as a research method, the performance score has been a really valuable compositional tool for how to put the practices of reenactment and pilgrimage together. And finally, throughout the presentation, you'll see like glimpses of visuals, so Polaroids and things like that. So I've been dealing with a documentation approach called theatre archaeology. So I've been engaging with Mike Pearson and Michael Shanks's theatre archaeology, an approach which focuses on the description and documentation of devised performance. And Mike Pearson talks about it as the retrieval and reconstitution of ephemeral events, because pilgrimages, as we know, are often ephemeral events. So within my practice, I use the theatre archaeology approach to assemble the ephemeral experiences of performing pilgrimages. Most recently, they've been focused on reinterpreting Virginia Woolf's walking history, but this will later expand to cover my own autobiography and lots of different dimensions. So Waymarker 1, Monk's House, St Peter's Church in Rodmell, East Sussex, 2023. Emmy, stand outside Monk's House, study and observe Virginia Woolf's house. Put on brown fur coat. Leave from Monk's House via the garden gate, wearing a fur coat, boots, and carrying a walking stick. Walk around the churchyard, observing and studying Monk's house from the church walls. Read aloud Virginia's last letters. Address the words to the house. Imagine the unheard words she may have said to her home on her final walk. So, one of the main insights that I've discovered in my research is discovering the connection between reenactment and pilgrimage. So in this project, I've been exploring reenactment as a creative strategy to examine how reenactment and pilgrimage do share very strong parallels. They're both concerned with restaging past events in many cases. So Kamila Baraniecka-Olszewska remarks that reenactment is often a significant component of pilgrimage, and that actually many pilgrimages involve the restaging the life stories of saints or heroes or performing other sacred histories. So this year I undertook a pilgrimage reenacting Virginia Woolf's final walk. Before this pilgrimage, I constructed a performance score excuse me, to activate my reenactment process. So the score really resembles a chronological timeline of Virginia's final movements on the day of her suicide. So the timeline was really assembled from a range of biographical accounts detailing the walk. And if anybody wants a biography of Virginia Woolf, I have loads now. So, you know, from those different accounts, they include the outfit that Virginia was last seen wearing and the route that it's believed she took. So from this, I was able to construct a score for myself that corresponds and parallels with Virginia's movements, reenacting as much as possible her movement towards her final destination of the Southeast Bridge. Thus, the performance score resembles a dialogue between Virginia and my own movements, as an exploration of bringing the past events into the present, and evaluating again the intersection of pilgrimage and reenactment practices. Waymarker 2, Rodmell Brooks. Emmy, head towards the river to Southeast Bridge. Audio record what you see and feel as you follow the route towards Southeast Bridge. I clutch my heavy brown fur coat against my chest to keep out the cold. I imagine that Virginia must have also clutched her fur coat against her chest to keep out the cold in March 1941 during her walk. So a real key finding that has kind of emerged from my experience of reenacting Virginia Woolf's final walk is really experiencing a sense of slippage between the role of reenactor and pilgrim. So performance academic Catherine Johnson observes that reenactors have described intense moments of historical connection, moments where almost they feel as if they were in the past, or if they were really for a moment the historically inspired persona they perform as. So her statement suggests that the reenactor is in a state of historical immersion of the significant persona's life, although for a very short period of time. So similarly, in my thick description account, which is a well-known theatre archaeology method, I refer to how I clutch my heavy brown fur coat against my chest to keep out the cold. And throughout that thick description, I refer to how I continuously imagine Virginia's inner thought processes, interweaving with my own. There is an energy, a relentless energy that propels me forward away from Monk's house. I imagine Virginia must have similarly been propelled by a relentless purpose to reach the river. So Tim Atchells describes the doing of a written performance score as a manifestation, a filling in of its gaps. It's a strategic embodiment. So through the doing of that performance score, that pilgrimage, I feel as I begin to embody Virginia many times during my reenactments. You know, we're wearing similar clothes. I place stones in my pocket. I feel a sense of deep unease and isolation in that environment, but I also feel the cold. We're both walking in the spring. And I also sense a sense of, you know, propelled purpose to reach this bridge. I can only imagine what she's feeling, but there's a sense of slippage and connection there. So Catherine Ob Johnson observes that reenactors value the merging of self and character, whilst recognising this only occurs momentarily. So similarly, Ian Reader explains that the pilgrim temporarily casts off their mundane status and becomes akin not just to the sacred figures they walk in, so they become almost akin to that sacred figure. So both the pilgrim and the reenactor roles temporarily merge with the figure they are pursuing. So therefore, this would suggest that both the pilgrim and the reenactor experience some moments where self and character merge, but only momentarily experience before a slippage occurs. So this has become a really important finding for the sense of the blurring of the role of the pilgrim, artist and reenactor, a sense of where maybe self and character merge, and there's some interesting slippage going on around identity and persona. So waymarker 3, Southeast Bridge. Emmy. Reach Southeast Bridge. Gather and select a range of stones to place in your pocket. Assess the weight of each stone. Place it in your pocket. Gather water from the river Ouse. Lay down walking stick, a way of commemorating Virginia. Stopwatch. So the findings from being at Southeast Bridge, 1 minute. So really the key finding from Southeast Bridge was really sensing a sense of rupture from not actually reinterpreting Virginia's final action of entering into the water. So lots of creative possibilities began to emerge from deviating from that performance score. So intentionally deviating from the set of instructions that I'd actually set myself. It actually created lots of ways of actually manoeuvring history. And Robert Blackstone writes really beautifully about the potential that comes from no longer being accountable to an original source and beginning to almost have more autonomy and creating your own narrative. So lots of possibilities emerged where I collected water. I began to commemorate Virginia relating to that landscape rather than that final walk. So for me, she became the River Ouse, she became the South Downs Way. Her as a person was related to that landscape rather than it just being the end. So I'm really interested in reenactment's ability to actually maneuver and find new ways of how we can alternate histories.
Hello, I'm Gareth. I've written a bunch of books about place, but this is my latest one Sunken Lands, which is a kind of a pilgrimage, I guess, in its own way, into the heart of my own climate change anxiety. It all began during the pandemic. I live in Hastings, and just to the east is a place called Pett Level, which is in the flatlands, heading towards Romney Marsh, out towards Dungeness. I decided to take my daughters on an improvised geography trip since they couldn't go to school, and they were a captive audience for once, and they thought they'd come along. As we went onto the shingle beneath the brown sodden cliffs, where David Bowie filmed his Ashes to Ashes video, a sort of Bowie's transformation happening in this place of renewal and change, you could see tree trunks and branches as far as the eye could see, all the way up to from the shingle across these sort of layers of slippery peat out towards the sea. This is the remains of a Mesolithic and Neolithic, different sort of ages, all sort of layered together, forest that once grew there, headed out towards France, back when the channel at that point was a sort of narrow river valley. There had been tribes people and hunters and gatherers living in this forest. It was at the southern end of Doggerland, which was that landmass that connected Britain to what we call Europe today. It would have then point not just been a land bridge, but the heart of a landscape full of gods and ancestors and people who called it their home. It was apparently a land of wooded valleys and lagoons, inhabited by humans for thousands of years. At the end of the Ice Age, and sort of at that sort of peak of the Ice Age, the last glacial maximum, the sea levels were hundreds of meters lower. But as the planet warmed, the glaciers melted and proglacial lakes burst, unleashing mega floods that swamped low-lying plains, sent tsunamis crashing across the landscape, turning peninsulas into archipelagos, vanishing islands altogether, swamping land bridges, and turning forest to salt marsh. In 6200 BC, there was a series of landslides off the coast of Norway, submarine landslides called the Storegga slides, that triggered a tsunami that totally devastated Doggerland, probably severed Britain, and was the initial geological Brexit event, severing us from Europe, turning Doggerland into a bank of sand that would eventually disappear. So as I was there at the sort of southern end of Doggerland, watching my daughters running over the bones of a Mesolithic forest, I began to feel a connection to a prehistoric world, back in a time where a similar story was ongoing, where huge changes had gripped the earth, and where the people had lived in a place that they called home, and a reality they called reality, in a kind of stable world they probably thought stable, was radically changing, becoming transformed. And when you see glimpses of these sort of forests as submerged lands, sort of underwater ruins, it inspires a sense of longing for what is lost, not just for the landscape that is lost and the features that have been lost, but for the memories that have been lost. I've become obsessed with this idea of the lost past. Is it retrievable at all? When things disappear from a life, when whole people disappear without any kind of culture left, material culture, can we still intuit what is happening? What happened to them? And I think you can. And that was kind of the quest of the book, because the memories of what happened at the end of the Ice Age and those thousands of years of global warming, rapid global warming, still linger on in the form of folklore. They're the heart of the three Abrahamic religions. There's over 2,000 global flood myths. Stories are found like the Atlantis, East, the Lowland Hundred in Wales, Lyonesse in Cornwall. So in a sense, we're all children of the floods. All of us have descended from peoples who've undergone these huge traumas back before living memory. I remember in 1979 at primary school, sitting on a rug, singing "The Wise Man Built His House Upon the Rock." And we do this when the rains came down and then the floods came up, kind of thing. So reenacting really what is effectively a Mesolithic trauma, a kind of ancient ritual going back long before these stories were kind of enshrined in the Bible. Then after that song, we sang "The Animals Went in 2 by 2, which is another flood story. And again, every single child had this sort of embedded into our culture from a young age. And I was obsessed with underwater kingdoms at that point. I loved all the films with Doug McClure going down into the center of the earth, anything with dinosaurs, which were just basically giant lizards transposing people. But I loved all that stuff. And so I decided at age 7 to become a novelist. And I wrote my first novel. It was called The Travel to the Underwater Palace. And it was in this lined notebook. I did the dedications at the back, the blurb. I think I called myself Gareth E. Rees. I think even then I'd started doing that sort of wanky name. And I dedicated to my teachers, and I crossed it out because I think I must have fallen out with one of them. Anyway, this story was about these sailors who hear of an underwater palace and they travel across these different lands. It's basically a psychogeography of this kind of imagined land. They go through different landscapes with demons and dinosaurs and volcanoes. They eventually get to this part of the sea, and there's this spire coming out of the sea. I even drew it on the front cover. It's all covered in kind of colourful scales, like a narwhal horn, kind of all twisted and organic, just sticking out of the water. And all the sailors in my story are all dancing around with excitement, except one guy. It's not actually Captain Doom, it's Captain Boar. And he just stops, and I describe him just looking melancholy at the spire, which is a really strange note in my story of daring do and just relentless violence. At that time, I had moved to Derbyshire, in Gloucester in Derbyshire, and I was very, very close to the Derwent Reservoir, where this exact sort of vision was to be seen. There was a church spire sticking out of the water. I have no recollection of going there. It'd been demolished before I actually moved to Gloucester. So what was it that I was accessing? What was this kind of really common symbol of the church coming out of the water? I seem to have some kind of access to this because my follow-up book was called The Secret Island. And in that, there's this island that disappears after 100 years. Every 100 years, it just emerges from the sea, and the sailors go there and they have adventures. But that was very similar to the legend of High Brazil, which is this similar kind of story off the coast of Ireland. So perhaps my imagination had accessed this kind of cultural memory, this kind of submerged traumatic events that are sort of filtered through our culture, some epigenetic memory. And it's this transmission of ancient cultural experiences of loss into the present landscape and into our present day of pandemics and global warming and ecological catastrophe that forms the pilgrimage I make in sunken lands. It's a sort of psychogeography of coastal areas where there are flooded forests and sunken towns, either from the past and present, and sometimes just imaginary. Stories that have sort of clung to geological features, glacial moraine. And I went from the pet level, which is the beginning of the story, you can see here, through to Wales, the Isles of Scilly, the Bay of Naples, and ended up in Louisiana wetlands, which is the fastest sinking landmass in the world. One of the places, for example, where I started was I thought just start with home. So I went to my dad's hometown of Wrexham, and this is Bangor-on-Dee, which is just near Wrexham, which is where my great aunts lived, just by the race course. As you can see here, the church is sort of disappearing behind this ever-increasing bank of stuff, and there's gabion walls and bits of sort of flood defences to protect it from the rising River Dee. Wales is so sort of plagued at the moment by flooding that the national government there has declared a climate emergency. But this goes way back. I mean, Wales is totally saturated in flood mythology. Almost every lake in Wales has some kind of sunken town at the bottom of it. In 1188, the Archdeacon historian Gerald of Wales went touring Wales, and he went to a place called Llyn-Llyfadden, where locals told him that they experienced visions of this lake adorned with buildings, pastures, gardens, and orchards. The waters would turn green overnight. Red channels appeared as if blood flowed through invisible veins. And when it iced over in winter, they heard groaning from its depths. And William Camden in 1586 also wrote there of an ancient tradition that where the lake now is, there was a city which was swallowed up by an earthquake and resigned its place to the waters. Archaeologists say that this may have been a trace memory of ancient communities who lived actually on the lake on something called a crannog, which is like an artificial sort of lake-dwelling raft. They might have been affected by climate change, because at the end of the Bronze Age, there was a really long dry period, about 300 years, which these kind of lakes would have dried up. And then there was a huge sort of onslaught of rain at the beginning of the Iron Age. You can see this in the Lincolnshire Fens as well, where you have the appeasement rituals at the end of the Bronze Age, swords and sickles and cauldrons and jewelry thrown into these places where water meets the land, where these inexplicably rising waters would have started to subsume their homes. And it's from this, perhaps, that some of these folkloric tales come. It could have happened to the people of Llyn-Llyfadden, and their experience, the ghost of their experience, would have lingered on in their folklore for centuries afterwards. At the end of the Ice Age, Wales was linked to Ireland by a big glacier, and there was basically nothing more than a proglacial lake between the two lands. This lake was apparently breached about 15,000 years ago, according to an author, Philip Rungadlier, and it unleashed a mega flood that swamped the whole sort of Wales and southeast of England, killing 2/3 of the Paleolithic population that lived there. And after that, that sea began to expand and expand, taking more of West Wales and the flatlands. And this seems to have entered into folklore in the Black Book of Carmarthen, one of the earliest surviving manuscripts in Welsh, which tells of the drowning of the land of Gwyddno, which is the land to the west of Wales. And this story is a king who is a decadent king, builds all these sluice gates and walls to protect his people from the sea. He has a big feast one night. Usually these stories end with a feast. And the floods come, the gatekeeper is too drunk to operate the gates, and the waters come in and drown them all. They have to escape through these causeways up to the higher land. This story is purportedly set, according to the Book of Carmarthen, in the 4th century AD, but its roots probably reach much further back than that. There's a geoscientist called Patrick Nunn who's tracked old ancient flood myths, and he's looked at how they've tracked the sort of peat sediments in the seabed around that area, and they've worked out that it's probably the last time the kind of landscape that's described in those stories existed in Cardigan Bay, back when it was a forest and not a big sort of chunk bitten out of an apple, would have been 9,000 years ago. So it may have been from this period that the very first stories originated, when the people were forced to kind of flee to higher ground. Nearby, this is pictures of Borth. So this is Borth. This is the land of the Lowland Hundred. This is in Cardigan Bay in West Wales, where if you go there now, you'll see these incredible sites. It's a shattered forest. It looks like a real forest that existed until a minute ago when a nuclear bomb just went off. You can see the whole thing. You really sense the ghosts in the place. You can sense the hunting grounds. They found child's footprints there, remains of fires, all sorts of signs of human habitation. But history is repeating itself because this same landscape is being cursed by floods again. So this is a town nearby called Fairbourne, which is built in a marsh right in the sea. It's got a river behind it and a quarried land behind it that kind of sluices rainfall down, and it's got the rising sea. So on 3 sides, it's being attacked. The government said after 2050, that's it, they're not going to give any more funding. So this town is effectively doomed. It's going to be one of the first climate change refugee towns in Britain. And as I was exploring it, I went to this is the public toilet. And on the outside of the public toilet is this incredible picture of this sort of merman pointing down towards the sea defences. And it's interesting because just up from the coast from here is Dillon's Rock. Dillon's Rock is a great glacial erratic that has obsessed people for thousands of years. And it's supposed to be the place where Dillon was transformed from a human into a human man-fish. Dillon's a founding figure in Welsh mythology, and it's potentially been linked to kind of Mesolithic sea gods that came before. And he was transformed into this sort of fish-like creature. And I wonder if this sort of toilet wall mural is somehow a kind of plea to these old gods from the Mesolithic in the second time of climate change. As I sort of traveled around Britain, the more I kind of went around the coast, I kind of got the sense of this sort of ghostly perimeter shelf of submerged cultures and lost memories. This is the famous one in Cornwall, which is just near Penzance at St. Michael's Mount, which in Cornish was known as the Grey Rock in the Woodland, and it would have been surrounded by the same kind of forests that I was seeing in Borth and in Pett Level. Pine and oak tree stumps have been found there, and again, carbon dated between 4,000 and 6,000 years ago, so they're completely contemporaneous with these other forests that I visited. And this is the site of Lioness, which is Lioness is the kind of the Cornish version of the East myth and the Lowland Hundred myth. And there was a land bridge that went all the way out to the Isles of Scilly at one time, at the peak of the last glacial maximum, which then got flooded. Even it was one big island for a while. I think even the old Cornish word of it for it is the Big Island. By the time of sort of 7,000 BC, it was beginning to fragment and fragment into smaller and smaller and smaller islands, and to create the kind of archipelago of the Isles of Scilly that we know today. So this is one of the Iron Age villages that I visited when I went on to St. Mary's, the main island in the Isles of Scilly. So this is the kind of these were people who had already suffered climate change. So this village was relocated from further down on the coast, and so they would have dealt with all of these same problems. It was like between a very, very small amount of time, I think it was about 500 years, where just because of the way that the landscape was, that the smallish sea rises caused catastrophic loss of land, and the people who lived there had to sort of relocate, and they kind of were an early kind of adapt or die thing, which is what the kind of UN is recommending we do now. And it's in places like the Isles of Scilly where you go here and you see this sort of history repeating, where they're acutely aware of climate change and the effects of floods on their island. They've got all sorts of measures in place to try and protect their fresh water. They're using green technologies, the subsidies for businesses to go green, the electric cars. You notice the places like this in the front line are acutely aware of what's happening with global warming, and where the kind of stories of myth and legend aren't too far away. Ultimately, we can never really know precisely what was lost or how much was lost or what the people who experienced these things really felt. 98% of human history has never been recorded. Cultures have risen and fallen. Languages have died. Major planetary events are missing from the collective memory. Important ports, cities, and temples have been submerged. Islands have vanished. But these lost things still exist. Everything that has ever happened is contained in the present. Humans are an accumulation of inherited experiences going back to our ancestors on the plains of Africa. We are each one of us a living history, if only we could remember ourselves. So my book, Sunken Lands, is really an attempt to intuitively reach that lost past through the processes of looking at mythology, imagination, and walking through landscape. Thank you.
About stopping the invasion on our southern coast, and which party is not. Some 40,000 people have arrived on the south coast this year alone. Many of them facilitated by criminal gangs, some of them actual members of criminal gangs. So let's stop pretending that they are all refugees in distress. The whole country knows that that is not true.
So my pilgrimage was from where I used to live, Faversham, on the A2 on Watling Street, Ospringe, right near Maison Dieu, in fact. And I walked to Dungeness, the southeast tip of Kent. It was a place that had some significance for me. My dad used to work there. In my mind, it's the place that killed him as well, because like many people who worked in the nuclear industry, he developed a brain tumour. Other people died of mesothelioma, leukemia. There's quite a big cluster in that area. So I walked 140 miles over 5 days on the English coastal path. Not kind of Hamish Fulton kind of lengths of walking, but 140 miles for me was quite a lot over 5 days. So I did this in March 2019. I started on Monday, ended on Friday, and Friday was the day that Brexit was supposed to happen. And as is always the case with psychogeographic peregrinations, it didn't work out that way. Theresa May cancelled Brexit. So my walk was entirely without purpose. But what it kind of resulted in is some photographs and some words and a book, ultimately. And I'm just going to read some stuff from the book. And because it's late in the day, I thought I'd put on some distracting music in the background, which is by a band from Deal called Degradation, which is a lovely name, I think. And they work in, you can catch Dom and George, they often hang out and work in Smugglers Records in Deal. So they're very much on the border themselves as well. And this is from the LP Lead Lines, which I've kind of edited together. Some of the more less noisy bits, believe it or not, but I leave it quite low in the background. 29th of March 2019, 11 o'clock. It's the day before Brexit's due to happen. I arrive at the tea room at Dover's Southbourne Lighthouse, being decked out in Fulton's decor. The National Trust invites us to gaze upon the wonders of China teapots of different sizes and shapes, China cups and plates, all decorated in floral, chintz, gold-trimmed spouts, pearlescent nacreous coatings, countless shades of blue. I'm stopping here to rest weary, blistered feet. I'm having tiffin and tea, which is suitably old-fashioned. I find it akin to stepping into some sort of heritage theme park, but it's oddly also of the moment. It's not so different from any number of hipster-run shabby chic cafes you might find elsewhere on the Kent coast, in Margate, Folkestone. The constantly piped virulent music, embellished with vinyl crackle, begin to take on hauntological qualities of the type infused about by people like Mark Fisher. There's a strange metaphysics of presence here, notions of the past and present collapse. The recording is from another era, but the white cliffs remain, and Vera Lynn at that time was still with us. Was it a simulacrum of the past, or is this our present reality? The ambience makes me woozy. I have to depart in the cold morning air to clear my head. 12:30, same day. I descend into Dover. In World War II, this was Hellfire Corner. The first raids of 1940, local children were then evacuated to rural Sussex. The town's population shrunk from around 40,000 to a little over 16,000. Despite this, nearly 200 civilians were killed by the bombing. 900 properties wrecked, the most badly bombed of British towns in relative terms. Post-war, much of what survived was beyond repair. Renowned planner Patrick Abercrombie, who oversaw the rebuilding of Hull, Plymouth and Bath, advised Dover Council to replace the destroyed Esplanade and Marine Parade with open gardens linking the town and the harbour to ensure the town would link and function both as resort and port. Despite the protestations of the Royal Fine Arts Commission, the 9-storey block of flats you can see in the background here was built. It still dominates the seafront some 60 years later. It cuts off the town from the coast. It's like a defensive wall. Any pretense Dover might have had to be a tourist resort was lost. 1 o'clock, I traipsed through a retail park. I walked to the west of the town, up an elongated hill between the River Dower and the Western Docks. It's studded with fortifications. Here, the Western Heights defences rise vertiginously above the town, built on the site of a former Roman lighthouse. These defences are 2 ditches 50 feet deep, lined with red brick, designed to be swept with artillery fire in the event of an invasion. They're probably not noticeable to the many car-borne travellers passing through the docks, but the Western Height fortifications are more extensive than Dover Castle itself. In 1864, they were home to 4,000 troops, 160 guns. In World War II, the Central Redoubt became a lookout. It was surveying for long-range shelling from France. In 1965, it was the filming location for Peter Watkins' controversial film War Games, which depicted the aftermath of a nuclear strike. Later, the citadel at the heart of the complex was converted to a prison, and latterly, between 2001 and 2016, was an immigration removal centre. The English Heritage Information Boards that surround the prison-like structure were oddly silent about this function, as if they were embarrassed. 2 o'clock. Perhaps the most striking military remnant on this stretch of coastline is a large concrete sound mirror at the top of Abbott's Cliff. We'll see it in a minute. The forerunner of the radar, this resembles a large listening ear, designed to concentrate into audibility the forms of distant noise like aircraft engines that would otherwise exist beyond the range of human hearing. Built in 1928, it was captured by Ravellis in one of his last paintings, 1940's one bombing the Channel forts. In this painting, the sound mirror is at the centre of the composition. The lifeless, flat channel is behind it, illuminated by searchlights and fire. A large circular glow on the horizon suggests a bomb has just hit its target. Dover or Ramsgate, we don't know. The mirror remains an unsettling presence in the landscape. Unlike many other derelict military sites along this stretch of coast, it's been infused over by bunkerologists, brutalists alike. In Daisy Haggard's 2019 black comedy, Back to Life, the sound mirror is the backdrop to a murder. The young girl has her head smashed against it in a fit of rage. The sound mirror is a recurring motif in the story that focuses on the lack of compassion and forgiveness shown towards outsiders in English society. The function, the history of the sound mirror is never spoken of, but its obsolescence speaks to questions of modernity and Englishness. Are these monuments to a failed modernity, perhaps? Or is our obvious fascination with these anachronistic radars related to our continuing anxieties about threats to the things that lie beyond our field of vision? From Abbott's Cliff, it's a 20-minute walk along the crumbling cliff-top pass to the Battle of Britain Memorial at Capel Fern. Remarkably, this is one of 3 Battle of Britain museums in Kent. Count them. It sits on the site of a former airship launching platform and gun battery. Spectacular views over the channel. It was opened by the Queen Mother in '93. The memorial is formed of a large propeller-shaped chalk insignia sunk into a circular brass amphitheatre. Its proportions are weirdly like a Neolithic henge, suggesting there's some sort of continuity of occupation here. Its creator, Harry Gray, suggests the chalk propeller alludes to earlier traditions of chalk art in the landscape, most notably the Uppington horse. To the centre of the propeller, there's a sculpture of a pilot sitting cross-legged looking out to sea, with badges of 63 squadrons that participated in the Battle of Britain carved in the pedestal at the base. There's a memorial wall to the back of the site. Its sombre black panels listing all the Allied airmen who took part in the battle, 1,500 men and women who died. It's contemplative and moving. Visitors move along the memorial wall, looking for names of grandfathers, uncles, relatives who made the ultimate sacrifice. At 4 o'clock, on the day before Brexit, that didn't happen, I'm passing remains of a Roman villa on the cliff above East Bay, Folkestone. I passed 3 Napoleonic Martello towers, The English coastal path descends onto sunny sands into Folkestone Harbour. During World War I, thousands passed through this and took this journey. Some were on their way to the Western Front. Others, however, were arriving to seek a new life away from the turmoil of the continent. From 1914 onwards, the sight of crowdy and hungry, emaciated Belgian refugees arriving at Folkestone Harbour's arm was a near daily occurrence. 100,000 European refugees passed through the town before moving on to purpose-built settlements in other parts of the country. 16,000 Belgian refugees arrived in one day in October 1914. There's no memorial to this. These Belgians were provided with hot meals by local inhabitants who set up a refugee committee. They created and circulated a Franco-Belgian newsletter for the visitors. Frederick Bobby, who just purchased a series of houses on the Sandgate Road to develop a department store, which later became Debenhams, postponed their demolition to allow Belgians, refugees, to live in these homes. King Albert of Belgium visited on several occasions. He was generous with his praise for the townsfolk, stating, "Folkestone earned the admiration, not only of Belgians, but the whole world. The whole civilized world know that the town of Folkestone received Belgian refugees with such cordiality, it will never be forgotten." I don't know of anybody who knows that story. I mean, maybe you do, but it's not one that's commemorated in the landscape. Everywhere where we walk in Kent, we are haunted by the footsteps, the echoes of war. This is the sound mirror that I was talking about. So really my reflections, and I was going to read a bit more that I probably won't. When I made that walk in 2019, there were 3 refugees who had drowned crossing the Channel, trying to get to Britain. As of this week, as you probably know, it's tragically risen to 100. So I didn't really think that my project was going to be in any way. I didn't know what it was going to be. I didn't know it was going to be about the crisis of the border, the migrant crisis, the refugee crisis, call it whatever you will. But starting to think about the way in which that kind of the memorialisation of the invasion myth and Kent as the bulwark coast is written so hard into the landscape that you encounter it, you feel it with every footstep. That really kind of moved me and encouraged me to start thinking about the kind of the response and the reaction and the way that the Kent coast is mediated today, and about the alternative heritage stories, the industrial, the ecological, the social infrastructures that have long existed there that are not celebrated, the heritages that perhaps we're not encouraged to see. And so in connecting this to kind of the tragedy of refugees drowning at sea, I'm not kind of, I suppose I'm trying to, it's a cheap way of selling my book, but I should say the royalties from my book go to the Kent Refugee Action Network, and I wish their work wasn't so necessary 5 years on, but it really is. So there are copies of my book for sale out there, and if you can't afford the 15 quid, I've got 2 or 3 copies here. Just pay what you want to, and I'll make sure the money gets to the Kent Refugee Action Network. And that's it. If we just let this play out, and you can enjoy the music for the next few minutes. And the photos are from a photographer who I've linked up with since I did the book. Some of these photos are mine, but most of them are from a guy from Ramsgate called Stuart Leach. And it's his kind of his COVID, his lockdown project. We all had lockdown projects, and his lockdown project was one that he started without knowing about my project of Walking the Coast. He did more or less the same thing, but photographically, and his very abstract photographs of the kind of the borderland, where very often the idea of the legal, the national border is sublimated in the landscape in a way we can't see it, yet we know it's there, I think are very powerful. So, you've got another 2 minutes of this, and I've got nothing more to say, but should we just let it run on and yeah. Unless you come on to the end, you hear a whole lot.
Yeah, okay. Maybe while it's playing out, we could invite the speakers onto the stage for Q&A, so feel free to come in.
This is actually, some of this is based on field recording, so this is the sound of Chinooks on a military exercise in the English Channel, and some of the other degradations music as the border patrol kind of going past, and Dom and George have kind of sampled it and turned this into kind of, yeah, a soundtrack of the English Channel, as inspired by Nurse by Wound, I think. That's what it's like, isn't it? Perfectly timed.
It's on a video in this for the archive.
So that's the pitch for degradation. Stuart, degradation is playing in probably short pitch. That's what soccer place they play on the 19th of September. Oh, that's a horrible man. You can't quite hear him. That's my sample at the end of the day. So I was kind of very aware I was walking the Kent coast, and I was kind of passing through Whitstable 2 days after Nigel Farage had been there, kind of rounding up the fishermen, telling us that we're going to get free fish for life. Anyway, sorry about the timing.
Brilliant. Great. Well, yeah, 4 very varied and fascinating presentations. So does anybody have a question, either for one speaker or for everybody? Yeah, go ahead.
I'm coming with a
Oh, yeah,
microphone.
Thank you very much. This is a question about the pilgrimage project. It struck me the difference between what you're doing and what traditional pilgrimage would be is that that would be something that was accepted as part of the culture and as a public expression. People seeing it would know what was going on. With you, it was kind of private. I wonder if anyone saw you doing it, they might think, what's going on here? I wonder if you'd like to comment on the difference between your sense of private, not entirely private, which you're presenting to us, but in a sense of personal reenactment, and that would be done in a traditional culture where it would be understood, the images and so on would be understood.
Yeah, thank you.
That's a is this microphone working?
Yeah.
Okay. No, thank you. That's a really fascinating question. I think even though that is a very personal to a degree, creative act of pilgrimage, it's also, you've always got that public aspect when you're performing pilgrimage because it's visible. So there's lots of different layers. Obviously, I'm a female walking in quite an isolated space, so I have a lot of it's interesting. I did see there was a dog walker that I passed who looked at me quite strangely with the fur coat in the middle of March, and there was an environmental group cleaning up the River Ouse who also looked at me quite befuddled by my expression. So you do get some strange encounters. People just look strangely at you that you're doing something kind of abnormal. I think there is always a publicness, there's always a visibility. I think in another pilgrimage that I made that responds to Virginia Woolf's street haunting, I was really drawn into playing with my own visibility as a pilgrim and trying to, also thinking about the visibility as being a woman. It's kind of really difficult to get away from that. As much as you try, your gender is visible and it's ingrained and embedded into the work. It's not something that I try to necessarily resist. I kind of go with the flow and see how that responds to spaces. But I guess it's different in terms of traditional pilgrimage. It's not overtly saying I'm here to worship. So I'm definitely interested in those very personal, private acts of pilgrimage that are driven by personal instinct and intuition.
Lovely, thanks, Emmy. Yeah, so another question.
Well, kind of Emmy again. It was about the, I think just as you were rounding up, you talked about the river and the route and Virginia Woolf as being, and you, sort of blipping into that as being some kind of assemblage, some kind of, and I suppose this is more an observation that in my own sort of seekings for place stories, I have observed something similar in the walking, that I would flip into maybe a character or a story of place. And sometimes you might find stories that take the same pattern, the same shape. So that it might be characters that are, you know, they're legendary characters, if not myths. But and they might be hundreds of years apart, but they end up playing the same role, and you can start to pick up those patterns, and they are actually patterns of place. They're not just ideas of people. They're very much embedded. They're readable when you walk. Yeah. So I just, yeah, it's just it wasn't really a question. It was just a sort of observation.
Well, I just wonder if perhaps after Amy, maybe others could also speak to that question about you know, how the historical nature of the path, you know, does become part of our walking, you know, when we're on a pilgrimage. So maybe we'll get everyone to say a few words.
That's great. Yeah, no, I definitely think that's really true, and it's a reflection that's echoed back in my work. I think within pilgrimage, there's often, you know, there's a preset, there's a framework, often, not always the same, but I think within all of our work, there was a sense of being in conversation with either if it was our own personal autobiography and lived experience, but also our family members, but also the political crises that so definitely right, the path generates the story for us. I can't remember, there's a beautiful phrase that Walking Author says about every walk, every step is a story, and I think that's really true. You can, as much as you try with the pilgrimage, you can try to force a story, but the path will tell you what it wants to be, so yeah.
In West Wales, the bit I showed you with Borth, so people there have always read the landscapes, they've read the terminal moraines of glacial deposits have been interpreted as the causeways to the Lowland Hundred. Now, of course, they weren't at all, but what they're intuiting is a true story. So weirdly, through this kind of reading of the landscape, same with the Dylan Stone, this sort of glacial erratic, there's something, people know there's something weird about it, but it's mesmerising. It's not supposed to be there. It suggests great forces on their own. But then it's fascinating that then you get this sort of more contemporary mythological story attached to the same features that are actually about something that they wouldn't have necessarily known at the time, but probably intuited themselves, kind of a sense of loss and a sense of the place around them. And I've noticed in Wales, these stories sort of attach themselves to similar kind of features throughout, and they move around, but they're always kind of telling the truth, weirdly. They're kind of universe archetypes, maybe. So there's something Jungian going on with that, I think. So that's what I found, definitely, when I was really writing that book. You read coastal areas, you can really read the stories into the landscape.
I can't really remember the question, but I think, yeah, well, the English coastal path had just opened up. I don't live in Kent anymore, and I'd moved to Southampton, and Brexit was happening. And I suppose this is the most direct motivation for why I wanted to do the walk then, was I've walked all of the English coastal path in different segments, and it used to be called the Saxon Shore Way in bits, and then it had just been opened up as English coastal path, and I thought it would be an interesting exercise to do it all in one go, without having any sense about how it relates to what my research is actually on, which is housing. So it was a bit indulgent. But I think the moment I started it was like I needed to be there at the moment of Brexit, because that's where the news cameras were. You know, the English border is everywhere and nowhere. They could have stood on, you know, outside St Pancras, you know, people coming off the Eurostar, but that's not what we saw. We always saw, you know, the Kent coast and Noah Panic at Dover and all of this. So I kind of wanted to be there and feel that, and I don't know why. I'm still not entirely sure why I needed to be there to sense that, apart from I felt it was about the identity of the nation, my identity as a person, and kind of trying to get a sense about the fact that a sense of a national identity comes from different landscapes and different places. It isn't just floating in the ether, it's just culturally produced. It has to be anchored around certain effective points in the landscape, and I think that's what my book at times tries to allude to, the fact there are certain points, you know, there's a certain hauntological thickness perhaps where there's, you know, an intensity of national feeling comes to the fore, and just how do we deal with that?
Listening to Emmy, I was beginning to wonder whether I should dress up as Charles Dickens, go back to Colton Park. I mean, he seems to keep haunting projects of mine lately, and I think, I mean, Gareth said that all these different layers of history are all sort of still there, and that's what all these journeys are about. I mean, touching on Phil's thing, one thing I didn't have time in the talk for was it's Watling Street goes right through the middle of Rochester High Street and Chatham High Street. and they're very different places. I mean, Chatham's every bit as historical as Rochester, but Rochester's full of all this Dickensian flummery, and it's flocked with tourists, none of whom go to Chatham. It's full of homeless people and really multicultural. And it's just fascinating kind of microcosm of Britain, just in the two high streets, which are just next to each other. So yeah, all these things, everything haunts everything else. It's in conclusion.
Well, I think we're at 6 o'clock now, so just have a final round of applause for the speakers, and maybe you can catch them over coffee. Yeah.